My name is Joe Levine. I'm a professor of philosophy here. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Well,
Can we? Yeah. If you can't hear us, maybe like
yeah.
there's all this green space in front of us. Yeah. Kind of like come on in. Yeah.
You guys can move in front of us too.
Yeah. They took away our power, not our power, but our electricity.
Yeah. It's like
We've got the power.
story time with Rachel and Joe.
Keep talking, I'm gonna grab it.
You have a portable speaker?
Keep talking, I'm gonna go grab it.
Okay. All right. So it looks like we may get some amplification in a minute. But at any rate, again, my name is Joe Levine. I'm professor of philosophy here. This is Rachel Weber. And
I'm a criminal defense attorney, and I organize with Jewish Voice for Peace, and I'm an adjunct in the SPEPIC department.
okay, I'm going to start off talking actually a little bit. I know this is the title of this was Anti-Semitism versus Anti-Zionism, and that we definitely will be addressing that. But I want to start a little bit with the history of Zionism, because one of the things that I think people are very unaware of is the extent to which and the grounds on which there had been, up until the last 4 decades or so, well, basically, but for a long time, there had been a very organized Jewish movement that was opposed to Zionism. So one of the things that's really important to understand is if you have not just marginal people, but if you have well-recognized, established voices in the Jewish community for decades, right, starting from the late 19th century through basically up until the Six-Day War, if you have those voices saying that Zionism is in fact not a good route for Jews, and I'll talk about what their specific objections were in a minute. But if you have that going on for decades after decades, this idea that somehow Zionism is essential to Judaism, which is part of the argument that's used to claim that anti-Zionism is the same as anti-Semitism. The idea being, my identity is being Jewish. Essential to my identity is Zionism. Therefore, if you attack Zionism, you're attacking my identity. That idea is, if you just know any history, is completely no basis. So let me just talk a bit about that history. So first of all, Zionism is a movement that arose in Europe in the late 19th century. It kind of had two strands. There was the strand from Eastern Europe, and many of the early Zionist thinkers of the 19th century came from Eastern Europe. And the Jews in Eastern Europe were highly oppressed. You've all heard about the ghettos in Eastern Europe, about the pogroms that used to happen. Jews who lived under the Tsar lived a very, very difficult life, and a very tenuous life. Anybody who's seen Fiddler on the Roof knows at the end everybody has to leave Anna Tefka, right? That was a fictional account, but that was a very normal occurrence. It's funny when Amherst Leisure Services put on a production of Fiddler on the Roof, I actually wrote a guest column for the Hampshire Gazette saying, you know, people should think about Palestine when they watch those people in Anatevka getting driven out of their home. That's what happened to all these Palestinians in 1948. Anyway, as you may imagine, that didn't get a great response. But anyway, so you had the yearning to leave the oppression of Tsarist Russia. And of course, there were many responses to that. One response was Zionism. We need a place of our own. And because of the role that Palestine and Jerusalem have played in the Jewish religion for the last 2,000 years, it wasn't surprising that they would pick this area as the place they would go to. But then there was another issue. The Jews of Western Europe, France, Germany, England, Central Europe, had all also been very oppressed, except that oppression changed dramatically with the French Revolution. After the French Revolution came a period of what was called in Jewish history emancipation. So in France and throughout most of Western Europe, up until the French Revolution, Jews could not be citizens of these countries.
Hello.
And they also lived in... is this better? Wait, is it on?
Yeah.
Is that better? All right.
Speak.
Okay. So up until then, they had lived in ghettos. They had lots of restrictions. And then with the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, a good part of Western Europe was the Jews were emancipated. They received full citizenship. Now, a very important issue during this period of emancipation, if you looked at Jewish leaders in the Enlightenment period, the 18th, 19th century, they would tell you that Jews should not be thought of as a nation or a people. They actually considered it anti-Semitic to think of Jews as a nation or a people. And again, remember, I said a people. That's a different thing from calling them people. Of course, Jews are people, right? All people are people. But a people, that's a particular kind of designation. And nationalism was built around this idea that peoples should have their own states. That was one idea. That came out of a certain kind of romantic tradition in 19th century Europe, and it led to Zionism and many other forms of nationalism, including Nazism, came out of that. The Nazis used to talk about blood and soil. So that was one move. But the other movement to which most Jews wanted to align themselves in that period was one that you might call it a movement of civic nationality. The idea that religious differences, racial differences are not relevant to one's role in the political community. Everyone in the political community who is a citizen should have equal rights, and we don't make divisions based on other ethnic or religious or racial divisions. So the idea, what many Jews in 19th century Europe, and especially Western Europe, felt was, if you tell us we're a nation and a people, then you're telling us we don't belong here. We belong somewhere else, right? And so it was considered anti-Semitic to say that about Jews. Whereas today, if you deny peoplehood or nationality to Jews, you're going to get called an anti-Semite, right? But that was not how the Jews of emancipation thought of it. Anyway, eventually, anti-Semitism reared its ugly head again in Western Europe. Theodor Herzl, who was the founder of the World Zionist Organization, but not the founder of Zionism, but the founder of the World Zionist Organization, was from Western Europe. He was very influenced by the Dreyfus Affair. People have heard of the Dreyfus Affair. Dreyfus was a Jewish captain in the French military who, on trumped-up charges as a part of the anti-Semitic movement, was arrested and court-martialed and imprisoned for many, many years. For treason, yes, for having given military secrets to the Germans. And nobody now thinks he was guilty at all, but it was part of the anti-Semitic movement, and it had a huge effect. So Zionism was born out of both of these strands, with the idea that Jews needed a place and that Jews were a people. But now, one of the interesting things about the early Zionist thinkers is they knew that most Jews did not think of themselves as a nationality. Most Jews at the time in Europe thought of themselves as a religious community. And so a lot of Zionist thought and writing in the late 19th, early 20th century was devoted to convincing Jews, you are a nation, you are a people, and you have to have a state of your own, right? It wasn't the prevalent opinion. And indeed, early on, in fact, in the late 1880s, the official Reform Jewish movement in the United States had a meeting, I think it was in Pittsburgh, and I think it was called the Pittsburgh Platform, where they asserted quite clearly that Judaism is a religion, and we are Americans in just the same way everyone else is an American. The only difference is we're Jewish, and these are Christian, and these are Muslim, or whatever. But this is not a matter of nationality. It was very crucial to them. So what were they especially worried about? Well, you hear today what they call anti-Semitic trope of dual loyalty? Hear that a lot. You're accusing Jews of dual loyalty. Well, this is actually what worried Jewish leaders at that period who were opposed to Zionism. They said, Zionism, if you tell us that we are actually a part of this other nation, then of course non-Jews on the nations in which we live are going to look at us differently. So you, by forming this exclusively Jewish nation, are in fact harming the interests of Jews around the world. And I think, the effects of that are true. To the extent that there's more anti-Semitism today, a lot of it probably has to do with the fact that I'm Jewish, we get tarred with the activities of what the Israelis are doing. And of course, the reason we do is that the Israelis are saying, and the leaders of most American mainstream Jewish organizations are saying, we're all one people, right? Except for when you criticize Israel, then you're told, well, you're not there, you shouldn't. Right, but consistency is not one of their main virtues. Anyway, so let me just mention that, a little more history and then go to, tell me when I've talked too much. So in World War, Palestine, as you may know, was ruled by the Ottoman Empire up until World War I. In World War I, the Ottomans sided and the Germans fought the British and the French, and the British and the French had their eye on the Middle East. They had been encroaching on the Ottomans for a long time, but they were really looking to take over the Middle East. And in 1917, when the war was within a year of ending, the British promulgated what was called the Balfour Declaration. People have heard of the Balfour Declaration? Anyway, what it said was that the British government looks favorably upon the development of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, what's significant about the Balfour Declaration, one, is no Palestinian Arab people were in any way consulted on this. At the time of the Balfour Declaration, I think Jews who had been immigrating for a while and had settled Palestine already, so there were many thousands that had come from Europe starting in the 1880s. But even so, at that time, there were only about 60,000 Jews in Palestine, and I don't remember the number of Palestinian Arabs there were, but it was many, many times that. I think at least 10 times that. But what they thought didn't count for anything. Then when World War I was over, and there was a treaty, a conference in Versailles to kind of remake the world order after World War I, the League of Nations, which had just been founded, in its wisdom, a bunch of Western nations, they thought, well, these primitive peoples of the Middle East, they can't run their own affairs. They need tutelage from us Westerners. So we'll take over, and they were given, and various countries were given what was called a mandate to prepare the people for self-government. But with the British mandate over Palestine, the Balfour Declaration actually got included as part of the mandate. So Britain, for the next 30 years, facilitated the development of state institutions within the Jewish settlement called the Yishuv. So that by the time we reached 1947, you already had a state in all but name. And then when war broke out, they were able to vanquish their enemies very easily. But during this whole period, there were sort of several principled forms of opposition within the Jewish community. As I said, there was the reform movement. There were also people who started to worry about what's supposed to happen to the Palestinian Arabs. Right? People didn't use the term Palestinian in those days, they just called them the Arabs. But at any rate, there were people who started to worry about that. Another sort of component just to throw in here is there was a division always within Zionism between what was called cultural Zionism and political Zionism. I don't know if people have heard that. If people have heard of the figure named Ahad Ha'am, who was a very important Zionist thinker of the early 20th century, he was a poet, he advocated cultural Zionism. Now, I'm not a fan of any form of Zionism, but cultural Zionism nevertheless was very different. The idea was that after centuries and centuries of oppression, there needed to be some kind of rejuvenation of Jewish culture, and the place for that to happen is Palestine, but not in the form of a state, not in the form of the coercive power of a state, rather in a way that would be cooperative with the people that are there. They didn't pay a lot of attention to actually finding out if the people there wanted this project, but nevertheless, their project was not to form a state. And it was the political Zionists who wanted to form a state. Again, that battle wasn't actually, it was definitively won within the movement by the political Zionists, not until World War II. There was a famous Zionist convention at the Biltmore Hotel in 1942 called the Biltmore Program came out of that, and that's when the American Zionists first declared that their aim is a state. They had never said that before. Remember, the Balfour Declaration said homeland, didn't say state. That was because that was a controversial term. But then it happened. But I just also want to mention another couple of minutes is even after the state was founded and the Nakba happened, and there was a war, and there was this worry, there's this David and Goliath image that all these big Arab nations are descending on poor little Israel. In fact, Israel defeated them all handily. They actually had a larger army than all the armies that invaded altogether, and they had training, and they had a war machine. What can I say? Nevertheless, after that, many Jewish organizations in the United States, ones that have, when I mention them, you'll be amazed if you know anything about their position now. So, have people heard of the American Jewish Committee? The American Jewish Committee is a very powerful mainstream American organization. In the 1940s and 50s, that organization, which spoke and represented a huge amount of the American Jewish population, that organization was officially non-Zionist. They did not subscribe to Zionism, and in fact, they sponsored important studies of the problems of the Arab refugees, what they call the Arab refugee problem from Palestine. That is, these are the people who had been expelled during the Nakba, but the American Jewish Committee actually cared about that. And one of their most important researchers, a guy named Don Peretz, wrote extensively about all of the problems that the refugees were facing and what could be done to help them. This actually mattered to this organization. So anyway, all of that history, and in fact, there was also, here's an organization I'm sure nobody's heard of. I only heard of it when they started sending me mail out of the blue after something I published, called the American Council for Judaism. Anybody ever heard of that? Anyway, it was run by a man named Rabbi Elmer Berger, and the American Council for Judaism was actually quite influential in the 40s and 50s. They were strongly anti-Zionist. They partnered with different Palestinian political operatives. They held, they spoke and published all over the country. And again, they became a marginal, insignificant organization only after the Six-Day War. But in the 50s, they really mattered. So there were all these organizations that clearly said, we are Jewish. Our Jewish identity has to do with our religion and our community and our traditions. It has nothing to do with kicking a bunch of people out somewhere else and establishing a coercive administration over them. That tradition didn't really stop. Well, at least within the mainstream community, it hasn't ever stopped. I mean, here we are, right? So that hasn't stopped, but it stopped in the mainstream community once the 6-Day War happened, and that's an interesting thing about what military victory can do. Some of the horrible things it can do. I do want to read you one thing, and then I'm going to hand it over to Rachel. Can you hold this for a second?
Sure.
I can expand on anything you want if.
Yeah, I think we're gonna go like Joe and then me, and then like we'll sort of see if we left anything out, and if it seems like there's time and it makes sense, we can take questions. But yeah.
So an important Palestinian political activist in the 1950s through the 70s was a man named Fayez Sayed. People heard of that? Yeah. He was very important. He headed the Arab Information Office that was in the United States, that was a wing of the Arab League. And then when the Palestine Liberation Organization was formed, he was the first one to head their PLO Information Office in Washington. And he was an extremely able and effective speaker and writer. There were a number of Zionists who were very worried about him. It turns out that there was a tremendous push to kind of get the Arab and Palestinian point of view into the United States in the mid-50s, and he was behind a lot of that. Anyway, of course, he was attacked as an anti-Semite, and to be fair, some of the government officials in various Arab countries like Syria did put out some anti-Semitic literature. I mean, it's not surprising, you dig up whatever dirt on your enemy you can, and it's not, governments never play fair. So, whoever the government is. But at any rate, so he was on a radio show.
Joe, are you an anarchist?
No, I'm serious.
Because I am, and I've never heard you say something so, sounds really like you're saying, but like, fuck all states.
No.
Okay.
But, by the way, this wasn't rehearsed. Anyway, so he went on this radio show to try to defend the Arab Information Office from the charge of anti-Semitism. And there had been many people who said that he was accusing Jews of double loyalty and double allegiance and the like. But he himself said, I am anti-Israel. I am anti-Zionist also. But I am not anti-Jewish. He said this on this radio program in the 50s. But then what happened next was quite interesting. He then handed Tex is the name of the radio interviewer, the show's host, a book asking him to read a highlighted section. So here's the highlighted section. When a Jew in America or South Africa speaks of our government to his fellow Jews, he usually means the government of Israel, while the Jewish public in various countries views Israeli ambassadors as their own representatives. The quote, Sayed pointed out, so that's really a claim about dual loyalty, right? The quote, he pointed out, came not from an Arab official, but from Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. At Sayed's prompting, Tex then read the book's title, The Government Yearbook of Israel, 1953 to 54. This statement, when Fayez read that out, this was a very popular radio show, and when he read that out, and many American Jewish officials, like in the American Jewish community and other places, saw what Ben-Gurion had read, they actually were furious. They were furious. And in fact, there was a meeting between Ben-Gurion and one of the heads of the American Jewish Committee where they said, look, you have got to stop claiming that American and other Jews in the diaspora, as it were, are actually your constituents. You've got to stop claiming that. And for a while he did. because, you know, he needed their support. But this just gives you an idea of just how much opposition and how important this issue of not being identified as a people, as a nation that needs its own state, how important that was. I will just mention one last thing, and that is, I mean, if you're going to be anti-Semitic, you're probably not going to be an Orthodox Jew, right? I mean, you know, the two don't go together all that easily. And yet, some of the most vociferous opposition to Zionism at its inception was from Orthodox Jewry. My own grandfather, my mother's father, was born in the old city of Jerusalem, and he was an anti-Zionist. Not, I don't think, because he was worried about the rights of Palestinians, so I never met him, so for all I know, maybe he did, but mainly on religious grounds. It was considered heresy. And I'll end with this one rather harrowing story, but it does tell you something about this. So in the early 40s, the most important, within the ultra-Orthodox world, the most important Talmudic scholar in all of Lithuania, which is where most Jewish religious scholarship was a rabbi named Elchanan Wasser. This man, his son actually was my teacher, first taught me Talmud. I grew up in a yeshiva in an Orthodox environment. Anyway, he was killed by the grandfather, Elchanan Wasser, was killed by the Nazis, but how he died was actually recorded by someone who was there. He was with his yeshiva when the Nazi mobile killing unit came through and said, everybody out, we're just going to gun you all down. And he asked the German captain, can I have 5 minutes to talk to my students? And one of the students survived. That's why we know this happened. And he said, okay. And then he said to them, you have to have pure thoughts now because you're about to be a sacrifice for God. And then here's the thing, to atone for the sins of American Jews and the Zionists. So this most revered Talmudic scholar in all of Eastern Europe, now, I don't believe this. I don't believe in God. It wasn't the Zionist fault that the Nazis did what they did. But nevertheless, that was his view. His Jewish view was that the Holocaust was a punishment for the Zionists and for Americans who eat bacon. Anyway, it's really telling that now the idea that Judaism and Zionism are, as it were, the same thing should be promulgated despite decades and decades of this fight. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I was whooping when you said Lithuania because that's where my family was forcibly pushed out of after having lived there for many generations. So yeah, I have a lot of love for the Lithuanian Jewish community. But yeah, so there's a few things I want to convey. So I'm going to kind of like bullet point them out right now and then sort of like dive in to each one a little bit. One is that from its inception, from when it was literally like a glimmer in, let's say, Theodore Herzl's eye, Zionism was a colonial project. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And one of the ways that we know this, and this is something that I actually have always appreciated Joe for, is the best place to look for evidence of the racial colonial project that was and is political Zionism is the primary sources. You go look at Theodor Herzl's diaries. Go look at the correspondences between David Ben-Gurion and his compatriots. I mean, there's no better evidence for what their intentions were than their own actual words, right? So, I mean, and as someone who I grew up Reform. I grew up outside of New York City, but despite that, I was the only Jewish kid in my grade until high school. So I got called all the names, all the slurs, all the coins thrown at the feet, all that stuff, which is crazy, but true. So I grew up sort of like a lowercase z Zionist. Like we weren't like, yeah, we're going to move to Israel, but the temple had an Israeli flag outside of it, and when we collected coins for tzedakah, which means charity, sometimes it was to go to Israel. And so when I learned later, like what these founders of Zionism actually said, it was so heartbreaking, and it was such a betrayal, because I had been lied to my entire life, and that's true for many, many, many American Jews. That is just part of the curriculum. We are lied to our entire lives. We have to be the ones to seek out the truth about how Israel was founded, who the founders are and were, who the politicians are, and who they've chosen as like bedmates, which is, Netanyahu is, well, yeah, I'm going to get into that in a second. And it's really heartbreaking. And many of us go through that process all by ourselves, because the sort of Zionist propaganda machine, which has successfully co-opted Jewish suffering and manipulated very real Jewish suffering, very real legacies, ancestral trauma. We are a diasporic people, but the manipulation of those truths by the Zionist political movement for political gains, not out of any like actual true, like even idealism. When you read their own words, it's so cynical. It's so racist and cynical. Anyways, it's when you go through that process by yourself and you can't ask your family about it because maybe you won't be invited to Seder, or you'll be told that grandma doesn't want you at her funeral, or like so many of us like really have had to choose like the family and the congregations that we grew up with, and every kid we went to camp with, and versus these truths that we were suddenly learning about. It's incredibly painful, and for a lot of people it takes a long time to go through. So I have a lot of compassion for American Jews who are starting to learn this information. Fortunately for me, after some years, I found Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a national organization. It says, I think like the tagline is like, led by Jewish values, we fight anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and we stand in solidarity with Palestinian self-determination. We're essentially like the only mainstream, like not mainstream because we're not, we're the only like large Jewish American organization that is explicitly anti-Zionist. So finding that, it was like, oh my God, I don't have to choose between faith and politics. I can like pray with people who also believe that Palestinians deserve self-determination and that, human rights should be upheld, everywhere. So that was, but yeah, if you don't have that, if you can't find that, again, it's really isolating, and I just want to say that I have a lot of compassion about that. And I'm happy to have one-on-ones with students if you want to like get into this more. I'm more than happy to do that. We can get a cup of coffee, cup of tea on me, whatever. So that's one thing, that going to the direct source material, there is just no denying that from its very inception, the creation of the State of Israel was a colonial project. Another thing is that the ways, it is our duty as Jews, and it is especially our duty as American Jews, to do everything we can to push back against the narrative that criticizing the Israeli government is anti-Semitic. That is our job. We cannot ask Palestinians to do that. It is our job as American Jews, especially because we're paying for it. Billions upon billions upon billions upon billions of dollars. We're paying for it, and it's literally being done in my name, in our names, right? So it's like, nope, no, thank you. Let's not have any of that, sir. So that's another thing, is just, we're in such a unique position. We have such a unique role to play in this movement, which is both really like inspiring, and it's also daunting, and it's a lot, so, but I feel so grateful that I've been able to, I've been able to find organizing spaces in which I can, be strategizing with other Jews about like, how do we best use this very unique position we hold to fight back against these myths that, criticizing Israel is the same thing as anti-Semitism. And I think that there's a few ways to do this, right? I mean, there's many ways to do this. First of all, regardless if you're Jewish or not, I hereby grant everyone permission to talk about Israel and Palestine. You don't need, like, one way that it's often silenced is like, well, you don't know enough, you don't live there. And then like for me, I've been to Israel, I've been to the West Bank. I rode in ambulances in the West Bank during the Second Intifada. I saw some shit, right? But still, it's like, nope, like you are just lying and you're making stuff up, right? I wish it was a lie. I wish I was making stuff up. If it had been a nightmare, that would be much better than the reality of what it is, right? So no matter who you will be told you don't know enough. That's bullshit. We all know plenty. We can use the same critical analysis that we apply to, any other government, any other political movement, you can apply here. Israel does not exist in a bubble that is, it wants to exist in a bubble that is, outside of any kind of impunity. And the U.S. backing has absolutely allowed that to occur at the cost of hundreds upon thousands of Palestinian lives. And that's a travesty, and that needs to stop now. So, like I said, just sort of embracing the fact that we all get to talk about this. You don't have to, be a scholar, and you can open your eyes and look at what's happening on the ground right now, and you don't have to read all the things that are happening at the UN. You can if you want to. If you need extra language, if you want to know why South Africa filed a petition at the UN to find Israel guilty of apartheid and war crimes, that information is available to you. But you don't even have to go there. You can just look at what's happening on the ground, and most importantly, listen to Palestinians. Palestinians know more about what is happening on the ground than any of us. Their political analysis is sharper than anybody else's, and we have to center their voices. So right now there are so many Palestinian journalists that are posting every day on Instagram, and sometimes it's just to say, "Hi, I'm still alive," and even that is an act of resistance, right? But the thing about the history of Israel is that there are patterns. And once you start to see the patterns, then you really get, it becomes uncanny how easily you can predict what's going to come next. Israel has violated every single peace accord, peace treaty, agreement it has ever made with any Palestinian entity. Every single one. What that sounds like to me is sort of similar to how the US government has violated every treaty it's ever made with any indigenous tribe. Right? And the reason it sounds the same is because it's the same playbook. It's the same colonial playbook. So when Palestinians say, they're gonna start carpet bombing Gaza, they're gonna level the villages, and then they're gonna build, condos on top of it, they are right. They're correct. And another reason that obviously we know that Palestinians are correct is, again, go back and read what Zionists were writing back in the late 19th century, back in the early 20th century. I mean, there are entries in Theodor Herzl's diary from 1895 that literally make it into Zionist policies in terms of how they are going to enact the Nakba 50 years later, almost word for word. So that's another piece of this, is that well, first of all, let's always reject empire's attempts to collapse history, right? It's our job to keep the timeline in mind, and we are going to reject efforts to compress 2,000 years of history where the Jews were expelled from Palestine, even though they remained in small communities, and then there was a uptick in immigration in the early 20th century, but still, there's no one doubts that on the eve of, let's say, 1947, the vast majority of people in Palestine were Palestinian. And they had been living there for generation upon generation upon generation upon generation. We are not going to elide over that history. And another thing we're not going to do is we're not going to let empire convince us that whatever is happening is inevitable. And that it just, there was no other way but for this to happen. I grew up with the story. It's like, well, Israel had to invade Syria because of XYZ. Israel had to, have this incursion into the West Bank because, in response to something Palestinians had done. And in every single case, if you just rewind the tape, like a tiny bit, it's like the Israelis are the provokers, and the Israeli army is really well practiced at provoking responses and then having like huge counter responses. I feel like already, like the fact that Israel bombed a Iranian embassy in Syria. Just think about that for a second. Like a diplomatic building of a country in another country gets bombed. 16 people killed, at least that was the last count that I saw. And so then when Iran responds, the response is all we ever hear about. And again, this is part of a very intentional media and propaganda strategy. And it's been happening from the very, very beginning. Oh my goodness, I lost my train of thought. Let me just look this up. Okay. Maybe we'll take a couple questions and then maybe the thing I was going to think of will come back. But I guess I do just want to say that okay, so here's some homework if anyone needs any. And obviously this is not for Palestinians because they already know this. But if you really want to feel angry about the history of the political movement of Zionism, it's called Plan Dalet, D-A-L-E-T. It was Plan D in the Israeli militia plan to empty Palestine of Palestinians. And it has things, so it was approved by Ben Gurion and some others. I can't remember if it was approved in the late 30s or early 40s, but it has language like this. So this is, it specified cities and towns that were going to be slated for complete and utter demolition, like razed to the ground, forests planted over it so that the remains couldn't be found, that kind of stuff. These are quotes. It called for destruction of villages, setting fire to, blowing up, and planting mines in the debris, especially those population centers which are difficult to control continuously. Mounting search and control operations according to the following guidelines: encirclement of the village and conducting a search inside it. In the event of resistance, the armed force must be destroyed and the population must be expelled outside of the border state. So the narrative that, it's always Israel that's just trying to act in self-defense and protect its borders is completely false, and it's been false from the very start. There are so many parts of how the Nakba happened and how it's been maintained and expanded with the Six-Day War, with annexation of the Golan Heights, with how when you look at the quote security fence in the West Bank, which is in some places 3 times higher than the Berlin Wall, how it juts in to Palestinian territory to capture like an aquifer, or to like cut a village like literally in half, or to cut Palestinians, like separate them from their ancestral olive groves, and then establish this huge network of Israeli-only roads that if Palestinians even walk on, even if it's just to get from part of their village to another part of their village, they will literally be shot, right? So it's this ongoing Nakba, which obviously we're unfortunately seeing in at a brutal scale today, where we have over 34,000 Palestinians have been killed. That's just, you always have to assume that these numbers are super conservative. I'm sure we're going to find out that that's like not even close. And then because of the blockade Gaza was already in a crisis before October 7th. So you have, 18 years of a blockade, and then you carpet bomb anything that's remaining. No more hospitals, no more. I think it's been like over a decade that there hasn't even been a mammogram machine in Gaza, in the whole of Gaza, and I'm a breast cancer survivor, and I find that super fucking offensive. Everyone deserves the right to healthcare. So on top of that, now there's no access to water, no access to food, no access to medicine. Children are starving. People are dying of preventable diseases. If you want to really have nightmares for the rest of your life, there's a report that an Israeli doctor just recently wrote about what's happening with Palestinian political prisoners right now. It's really, 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 really bad. And I read, as a defense attorney and as someone who does a lot of abolition work, I read tons of awful reports about what's happening in prisons. This is one of the worst things I've ever read in my life. So things are really incredibly, incredibly bad. And it's still the same story. It's a different scale, but it is the same land grab that the Zionists have wanted from the beginning. It's the same destruction of Palestinian culture and genocide of Palestinian people that has been happening from the beginning and was planned before 1948 even came around. So I just, want us to keep some of these things in mind. And again, I just encourage you to go to the source material if you ever have questions about these crazy self-hating Jews, why are they dissing Israel? It's I love being Jewish. I love being Jewish. And I hate the Israeli government.
I just wanted to add one thing about the charges of anti-Semitism today. One observation, as a Jew who has been involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement basically since the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, I have often remarked, just to myself, at how astonishingly little anti-Semitism I have ever encountered within this movement. I don't know what goes on in Europe. I don't know what goes on in the Arab countries. I'm not going to speak to that. But at least in the United States, I have just not seen it. It's really, and actually, you'd expect a little more. It really is important to think about this. They're pulling out every, remark that any student who's probably not even associated with the activists says, and saying, see, anti-Semitism. And of course, God forbid the person should be a Muslim or Arab, then, this shows they're all terrorists. But in fact, of course you're going to expect. Here you have a people with an army. Most Palestinians in Palestine, the only Jew they ever meet is a soldier with a gun, right? And those Israelis aren't saying, by the way, distinguish. I'm doing this qua-Israeli. I'm not doing this qua-Jew. That's not the experience. So of course people are going to have some antipathy to the people who are oppressing them. That's to be expected. What I find surprising is how little of it there is. And I attribute that to two things. One, to the fact that for so many decades, both here and in Israel and in the occupied territories, there have been Jews who opposed their government and have made themselves manifest to Palestinians and show that, okay, it's not about Judaism. It's not about being Jewish. It's this other thing. It's about being, a white supremacist, as it were. So that's one thing. But the other thing I want to say is look at the particular charges. I have read, I think, 10 articles in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in Haaretz, all over the place about this feeling unsafe on campus. And then you look for the incidents. Okay, so what actually happened? All right. And it turns out every once in a while, they can actually come up with an anti-Semitic incident. So if you shout at someone, go back to Poland, that's anti-Semitic. But if you say, no Zionists are welcome here, or even if you say things I don't think you should say, like this guy who was caught on video from the Columbia students, I don't know if you saw this, who said, Zionists don't deserve to live, right? I wouldn't say that. I think that's a bad thing to say. But it's not anti-Semitic. I mean, I'm a philosopher. I care about distinctions. You can say bad things for different reasons that they're bad. This isn't anti-Semitism. This is about Zionism. And it's very funny. In the same video, the guy then said, just like Nazis don't deserve to live. Did anyone say that he was saying no German deserves to live? No, he was saying no Nazi deserves to live. So he's therefore saying, is he saying no Jews deserve? No, he's saying no Zionists do. Again, I don't support his saying that, but it's not evidence of anti-Semitism. If you use that critical lens of looking, where is the actual attack on Judaism or Jews in the statements? If you go through all the incidents you see, I submit you'll find that 95% of the time, it has nothing to do with being Jewish. And the fact that, I don't know how many of you are Jewish, but the fact that so many of us who are Jewish feel so at home and welcome in all of these spaces, whether it's at Columbia, whether it's here, whether it's Berkeley, just makes it obvious that anti-Semitism is not involved in the slightest bit in this movement. Anyway.
So, yeah, so just super quickly related to that, I just want to talk about how From the River to the Sea and Free Palestine and Intifada are not anti-Semitic, because that's something that has really been coming up a lot on these campuses. So if you look at the history of the phrase From the River to the Sea, and you look at the political demands of different Palestinian resistance movements, let's say like through the 70s and 80s, what people were talking about was equal civil rights. Palestinians were saying, we exist, we live here, we've been displaced, we've been massacred, we are the largest refugee population in the world. There's been, there's generation upon generation of Palestinian born in refugee camps all over the Middle East. We exist, we want to vote. We exist, we want to own land. We want our house back. My grandma still has the keys and remembers when the Israeli militia came and kicked everyone out of the village, right? So those statements, if you take them in any other context, people would be like, of course people get to live, and people get to go home, and people get to return to the land that, return to the houses that their, great grandfathers literally built from the ground up, right? So, so those were the demands of a lot of different political actors and radical political movements in Palestine. And so, that this narrative that From the River to the Sea means that people want to push all the Jews into the sea, that's actually not true. And when Jews say that, really what they're saying is all the Palestinians should be pushed into the sea. Because they're saying, even just by claiming that they get to exist and they get to live and they should get to vote and they should get to have water and electricity and medicine, that those claims on their own are anti-Semitic. They're saying this whole land belongs to the Jews, and the Palestinians are the one who should be driven into the sea. And the Nakba, in a very short period of time, either massacred or displaced over 750,000 Palestinians. I mean, I can't comprehend that number. So, again, keeping things in historical context and not compressing the timeline, super important. Similar to Free Palestine, of course, free everywhere, right? Everyone deserves freedom. I mean, except Nazis, but.
But Germans
deserve freedom. Yeah, exactly. Everyone deserves freedom. And, when you look at the interconnections between, liberation movements throughout the global South, you see a lot of commonality because, Europeans and Americans were using the same playbook and sometimes the same personnel and sometimes the same military. And in the case of Israel, sometimes military being trained by the same people. They're enacting oppression. So when oppression is being done by the same forces with the same tactics, the the resistance is going to look the same. And let's never forget that wherever there's oppression, there's resistance. That's always been true since the dawn of humanity. So if you can recognize the legitimacy of liberation movements in South Africa, in El Salvador, in Vietnam, all over the world, I mean, if you dive into the material, you're going to see exactly, some very similar tactics, phrasing, strategies that Palestinian liberation movements have enacted over the decades. And it's, if it's legitimate in these other places because we believe that everyone deserves freedom, it's legitimate for Palestinians too. And the last thing I just want to say is you cannot create safety through oppression. That's not safe. That's not safety. In fact, as Joe was saying, the false conflation of Judaism and Zionism is really bad for Jews because it lumps us all together and it makes us look like we are just sort of mindless supporters of this like genocidal war machine. So safety is built through relationships. Safety is built through solidarity. Safety is built through diving into historical context, through holding nuance, through being really creative about what a right to return, can look like and should look like. That's where safety lives. And that's what we need to do, for each other. You can't trade someone else's safety for yours because that's not true safety. That's something else entirely. Yeah, questions?
At that time, I'll never forget talking to someone who was an avid Zionist, who unfortunately was my brother. But anyway, and I remember him saying the following, because at the time, Hamas had missiles that they were firing at Israel. And he said, if they send any missiles that hit Tel Aviv, we will just flatten all of Gaza. Okay? So I thought, okay, maybe that's just one crazy guy, but no. That is the idea of the deterrence of the balance of terror. Every one of ours they kill will kill 100, 200, 300 of theirs. That is the Israeli calculus. So when I saw what had happened on October 7th, I couldn't have predicted that. That came out of nowhere. Hamas, it was amazing how they kept that a secret all that time and managed to pull that off. But when I saw what happened, it was obvious to me that what was about to unfold in Gaza would unfold. That is just standard Israeli operating procedure.
So related to that, if you really want to look at what like a non-democratic government looks like, Netanyahu's government is a really good example. There's literally a law on the books passed in 2018 that self-determination is only for Jews in Israel. That's like, I'm not paraphrasing. That's like what the law says. And also, he makes weapons deals with like some actually anti-Semitic governments. He also sells all kinds of weapons tech all over the world. He sells surveillance technology to Uganda to use to like find and spy on and surveil and then execute LGBTQ activists. Israel was one of the only countries that broke the arms embargo in South Africa. So Israel was furnishing apartheid South Africa with weaponry. So the mythology is about it being like, a beacon of democracy. It's the only safe place in the Middle East for gay people. Ask any Palestinian queer person, they will assure you that, the same bombs that drop on everyone else also drop on them, and the same bombs that are killing everyone else are also killing them. It's just, and even like within Israeli society, there's just such deep racism. There are Black African Jews who are like offered, here, like we'll furnish you with like housing, and then they are, have to serve in the military, and they're often sent to like the most dangerous spots. I mean, there's tons of racial profiling of African Jews in Israel. Yeah, so I mean, it's a deeply, deeply non-democratic, racially segregated society for sure. So, you know, to sort of end on I don't know if we're ending yet, but it's always good to talk about like, what can we do, right? So one thing we can do is, well, there's this, right? So thank you so much to everyone for being here. Thank you to SJP for holding down this encampment and holding space for us to be together and talk together. There's also the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which has been around since 2005, a call from Palestinian civil society organizations. So we're talking like labor unions, trade unions, cultural organizations. And there are so many different BDS campaigns internationally and also right here on campus, which is exactly, you know, what SJP and dissenters and others have been fighting for, you know, for years, but especially this year, to have UMass divest from Raytheon, the second largest weapons manufacturer in the world, hugely complicit in the genocide against Palestinians. You know, another thing to do, again, you know, listen to Palestinians, believe Palestinians, read, watch. I mean, it's just, there's no shortage of like crucial Palestinian voices that we should all be listening to. And I feel super grateful that right here in this community, we have families like the Mushabeks who are here, who presented earlier. The only Palestinian-run publishing company in the country, only Palestinian publishing company in this country is housed right here in Hampshire County. Yeah, so, you know, great. There's books of theirs over yonder. Yeah. So something I just want to sort of like maybe wrap up on is this weaponization of Jewish pain. One place for me that heals that for me is when I find Holocaust survivors who are also anti-Zionist and the things that they said. So Marek Edelman was one of the last surviving leaders of the Warsaw Uprising. And he stayed in Warsaw. He never moved after the war. And for just every time he would be interviewed, even his last interview in 2012 before he died, people said, like, why did you stay in Warsaw? Like, why didn't you move to Israel? And he said, well, first of all, everyone that I know and love died here, and someone needs to tend to their graves. And that's fallen to me. Like, my dead are in this ground, so this is where I stay. But he also said, this is where I went to school. This is where I learned that people should take care of each other. This is where I learned that you fight where you live, you fight where you work. This is where I learned about, you know, worker struggles and how we had to, you know, like fight together to like fight for rights. This is where I learned all that stuff. So why would I go anywhere else? And I just, that's a, you know, a powerful testament to just, yeah, the what belonging can look like, and that anyone that in the name of racial capitalism and imperialism tries to tell me where I belong and, you know, how I get to belong places can go fuck themselves.
That's a good answer.
Oh, no, okay, yeah. Any other questions?
We'll be hanging around.
Yeah, we'll be
till
hanging
people
out.
want to talk.
Experience one-on-one conversations works much better. Like, you know, there's not going to be much, there's probably, I shouldn't say this, there's probably not going to be much great conversation like that that's going to happen at a setting like this, that's going to happen at a protest, that's going to, you know, like when like things are already set, you know, when emotions are already elevated, like you're sort of setting yourself up to lose. So finding a quiet spot, you know, like one-on-one conversations where you can really sort of like lean into your humanity and like, I think is the first thing. And in terms of, you know, conversational strategies, when people talk about, well, you know, I have, you know, friends or family who have been impacted by what happened on October 7th. I mean, I think that it's important to say, like, I hear that, and also, like, every Palestinian on campus and in Amherst and in Hampshire County and in this country is also dealing with those losses. And so, can we have a conversation where we don't just lock ourselves in, like, we don't give ourselves permission to stop thinking because we know someone who is grieving. In fact, maybe when we're in grief, that's like a really important place for for like being open to like sorry, I don't know how to end that sentence. It's like there in my brain, but it's like not coming out of my mouth. So I guess just to say, like, let's not allow our grief or even like vicarious grief like prevent us from talking about what's happening on the ground right now, because what's happening on the ground right now is like a literal genocide. It's that there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That is the only word to describe what's happening. And that doesn't make anyone's grief less important. I'm not telling anyone not to feel feelings. I'm not asking anyone not to, like, struggle with this stuff and have complicated relationships with people and have complicated thoughts and feelings and have a process. Everyone gets to have a process, but what we should not do is, like I said, let our vicarious grief allow us to be like manipulated by things that are so clearly designed to silence Palestinians and kill them and like allow for conditions where this country is paying so many billions of dollars for the killing of Palestinians.
What I'm about to say is not specifically to how to have conversations with your Jewish family in particular, but there is something. Again, this is a kind of philosophy tool, all right, that a lot of people, it flummoxes them in arguments of this sort. So someone will say to you, look what Hamas did on October 7th, or someone will say, look, I had a relative who died, or look, the point to that. And immediately your impulse might be to say, to either defend what they did, or deny that they did it, or deny that this happened. And the important thing to understand is that often it's not actually the facts, the first premise they come out with, the first thing they say that you need to contest. What you need to do is drive people to then answer the question, okay, let's say for the sake of argument, I give you that. What follows? So what? What does that show? Are you saying, therefore, you get to kill 30,000 of them? Is that your... And if not, then what's your point? But I do think the so what response is a very, very important response for people to learn in conversation. Because most of the time, people will point to things and bring up facts that often they're bogus, but even if they're not, they don't establish what they claim it establishes. And what you need to do is target the reasoning and say, look, you must be abiding by a principle that, of course, once it's stated, they would never agree to. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you argue with people.
Also get a philosophy and a PhD in philosophy. I'm joking.
Just one course.
I'm joking.
We need our numbers up.
Yeah. So again, thank you so much to everyone who's here and to all the organizers and to all the students and the faculty and the staff who are here. It's just amazing that we can all be together, all the community members. Thank you so much. And like I said, I'm here for Jews on campus who want to have like actual real conversations about this. So come and find me if you want.